The gunshot echoed across Sonora, California, sending a flock of startled crows into the azure sky as Temperance Parker ducked behind a water barrel, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild stallion. 5 years of carefully constructed peace shattered in an instant when her ex-husband, Leland Davis, had finally tracked her down, his rage as scorching as the California summer sun. "You can't hide forever, Temp," Leland's voice carried down Main Street, slurred but menacing. "A wife belongs with her husband." Temperance pressed her back against the rough wooden slats of the general store, dust clinging to her simple blue calico dress. At 28, she had hoped the nightmare was behind her, that the new life she'd carved out in Sonora would remain undiscovered. Her fingers instinctively traced the faded scar above her eyebrow, a permanent reminder of why she'd fled in the night 5 years ago. "Miss Parker," a low, steady voice cut through her panic. Temperance looked up to see the broad-shouldered silhouette of Blake Foster, Sonora's newest cattle rancher. Though he'd only arrived in town 3 months ago, his reputation for fairness and hard work had quickly spread. His shadow fell across her hiding spot, the late afternoon sun casting him in a golden halo. "Stay back, Mr. Foster," she whispered urgently. "This isn't your fight." Blake adjusted his worn leather hat, revealing eyes as deep and steady as the mountain streams that fed the valley. "Any man firing wildly in town makes it everyone's concern, Miss Parker." Before she could protest further, Blake stepped away, his spurs jingling softly as he moved into the street. Temperance's breath caught as she watched him position himself squarely between her and Leland, who stood swaying slightly at the far end of the dusty thoroughfare, revolver still smoking in his hand. "That's far enough, mister," Blake called out, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made even the most stubborn ranch hands respect him. He made no move toward his own pistol, which remained holstered at his side. "I don't know what your grievance is, but we settle disputes with words in Sonora, not bullets." Leland spat in the dirt, his once handsome face now bloated and red from years of hard drinking. "This is between me and my wife. Step aside, Cowboy." "Ex-wife," Temperance said, finding her voice as she emerged from behind the barrel, though she remained safely behind Blake's imposing figure. "I haven't been your wife since 1875, Leland." Blake didn't move, didn't flinch. He stood like an immovable mountain between Temperance and the man who had once vowed to love her. "The lady doesn't want to see you," Blake said evenly. "I suggest you lower that gun and leave town peacefully." The year was 1880, and in the 5 years since Temperance had fled her marriage, she'd remade herself. From terrified young bride to respected seamstress, she'd built a life in Sonora brick by brick, stitch by careful stitch. Now, watching Blake stand unflinching before Leland's drunken rage, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Leland's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I've spent good money and 3 years tracking her down. I'm not leaving without what's mine." "I was never yours to own," Temperance said, her voice stronger now. Several townspeople had gathered at a cautious distance, witnessing the confrontation. Among them was Sheriff Holbrook, slowly approaching from the side, his hand resting on his pistol. "Mr. Davis," the sheriff called. "You've disturbed the peace and discharged a firearm within town limits. Put down your weapon." Leland's gaze darted between the sheriff, Blake, and Temperance. For a terrifying moment, his finger tightened on the trigger. Then, with a bitter curse, he lowered the gun. "This isn't over, Temp," he growled as Sheriff Holbrook moved in to disarm him. "A woman can't just walk away from her vows. She can when her husband breaks his first," Blake replied, still not moving from his protective stance. As Sheriff Holbrook led Leland away toward the jailhouse, promising to put him on the next stage out of town, Temperance felt her knees weaken. She reached out instinctively, her hand finding Blake's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You had no cause to put yourself in harm's way for me." Blake turned to face her, his expression softening. "Every person deserves to choose their own path, Miss Parker. No one should live in fear." He offered a slight, reassuring smile. "Let me walk you home. I'd feel better knowing you arrived safely." As they walked together down the street, Temperance felt the curious gazes of townspeople. Most knew little about her past. She'd been careful to keep her secrets close. Now, with Leland's appearance, questions would inevitably follow. "He'll be back," she said quietly as they approached her small house at the edge of town. "Leland never lets go of what he believes is his." Blake's jaw tightened slightly. "Then he'll find more than just me standing in his way next time." He tipped his hat as they reached her porch. "I'll check on you tomorrow, Miss Parker, if that's all right." Temperance nodded, grateful for his steady presence. "That would be kind, Mr. Foster." As she watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun, Temperance felt both dread and something else stirring within her, something she'd thought long buried under the weight of her past. She quickly pushed the feeling aside. Attachments were dangerous luxuries she couldn't afford, not with Leland back in her life. Inside her modest home, Temperance lit a lamp and sank into a chair, allowing herself a moment of weakness as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. On her small mantel sat a daguerreotype of her younger sister Lily, taken before illness claimed her life 3 years prior. Lily had been the only one who knew where Temperance had fled, taking the secret to her grave. "How did he find me?" she whispered to the empty room. Sleep eluded Temperance that night, her mind replaying the confrontation in the street. Blake Foster's unwavering stance kept returning to her thoughts, the way he'd positioned himself between her and danger without hesitation. In the 3 months since his arrival in Sonora, she'd exchanged pleasantries with him when he came to town, even mended his shirts once or twice, but little more. He was unfailingly polite, sometimes bringing her wildflowers he'd picked on his property when he came to collect his mended clothing. Morning brought a knock at her door. Temperance approached cautiously, a kitchen knife hidden in the folds of her skirt, but it was Mrs. Daniels, the baker's wife, standing on her porch with concern etched on her kind face. "I brought you some fresh bread, dear," she said, offering a cloth-covered basket. "And to let you know that Sheriff Holbrook put that awful man on the eastbound stage at dawn." Relief washed over Temperance. "Thank you, Mrs. Daniels. We all saw what happened yesterday." Mrs. Daniels hesitated. "If you need anything at all, you have friends here." The simple kindness nearly undid Temperance's composure. "That means more than you know." After Mrs. Daniels departed, Temperance opened her shop adjacent to her small home. Focusing on work might keep her mind from dwelling on yesterday's events and what they might mean for her future in Sonora. She had 3 dresses to finish for the banker's daughters and a suit to alter for Mr. Henderson's wedding next month. The bell above her door jingled mid-morning, and Temperance looked up to see Blake Foster filling the doorframe, his hat in his hands. "Miss Parker," he said with a nod, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Mr. Foster." She set aside her needlework. "Please come in." Blake stepped inside, looking somewhat out of place amid the fabrics and half-finished garments. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen his share of hardships and come through them stronger. "Sheriff Holbrook asked me to inform you that Mr. Davis is gone. He made quite a scene at the stagecoach, but he's headed east now." Temperance nodded, trying to ignore the relief that flooded through her. "Thank you for telling me, and thank you again for yesterday. Most men would have walked the other way." "I'm not most men, Miss Parker." His eyes, warm as amber in the morning light, held her steadily. "No," she agreed quietly. "You're not." An awkward silence fell between them before Blake cleared his throat. "I actually came for another reason as well. My ranch hand, Tom, is getting married next month to Miss Sullivan, and he's in need of a proper suit. I told him there's no finer seamstress in the territory." Temperance felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment. "I'd be happy to help. He can come by anytime for measurements." Blake hesitated, then added, "There's also to be a social at the church this Saturday evening, a small gathering with music and food." He twisted his hat in his hands. "I thought perhaps, if you felt up to it, you might consider attending, as my guest." The invitation caught Temperance by surprise. Social gatherings were something she generally avoided. Too many questions, too many opportunities for her past to surface. I'm not much for socializing, Mr. Foster." Disappointment flickered across his face, but he nodded respectfully. "Of course, I understand." As he turned to leave, Temperance found herself speaking before she could reconsider. "But perhaps, Perhaps this once I could make an exception. The smile that lit Blake's face was worth the flutter of anxiety the commitment provoked. I'll call for you at 6, then. After he left, Temperance pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks. What was she thinking? With Leland's appearance, she should be planning her departure from Sonora, not accepting invitations to social gatherings. Yet something about Blake Foster made her want to stay, to believe that perhaps she could face her past rather than flee from it again. The days, until Saturday, passed in a blur of work and worry. Temperance found herself both anticipating and dreading the evening. She finished a midnight blue dress she'd been saving for a special occasion, adding delicate embroidery to the collar and cuffs. When she tried it on, the woman in the mirror looked like a stranger, someone hopeful, someone who might have a future. Saturday evening arrived with golden light streaming through her windows. Temperance pinned her chestnut hair into a simple but elegant style, allowing a few soft curls to frame her face. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. Blake stood on her porch, freshly shaven and wearing a clean black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. His eyes widened appreciatively when he saw her. "Miss Parker," he said softly, "you look beautiful." She took the arm he offered, suddenly shy. "Thank you, Mr. Foster." The church social was already in full swing when they arrived. Lanterns hung from tree branches in the churchyard, casting a warm glow over tables laden with food and a small area cleared for dancing. A fiddle and banjo played cheerful tunes while townspeople visited in small groups. Their entrance together caused a few curious glances, but most people greeted them warmly. Blake stayed attentively by her side, introducing her to those she hadn't yet met in town and making sure her plate was filled with Mrs. Wilson's famous fried chicken and cornbread. "You're quite popular," Temperance observed as another rancher clapped Blake on the shoulder in greeting. Blake shrugged modestly. "People are just being neighborly." "It's more than that," she insisted. "They respect you. In just 3 months, you've made quite an impression." "I could say the same about you," he replied. "Every woman here has mentioned how much they appreciate your skill with a needle. Mrs. Henderson says you saved her daughter's wedding dress after the disaster with the punch bowl." Temperance laughed, a sound so unfamiliar to her own ears that it startled her. It was certainly a challenge. As the evening progressed, Blake led her to the dancing area. "May I have this dance, Miss Parker?" she hesitated. "I haven't danced in years." "Neither have I," he admitted with a smile. "We can be terrible together." His hand at her waist was warm and respectful as he guided her through a simple waltz. Despite their mutual claims of rustiness, they moved well together, finding a natural rhythm as they circled the improvised dance floor. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Foster," she said as he skillfully turned her under his arm. "Where does a cattle rancher learn to waltz? My mother insisted all her sons learn proper manners, even on the frontier," he explained. She was from Boston originally and had certain expectations about civilization that couldn't be compromised, even in Colorado territory. "You're from Colorado?" she asked, genuinely interested. He nodded. "Born and raised near Denver. My father ran cattle there until he passed 6 years ago. My brothers took over the family ranch, but I wanted my own spread. California seemed like a good place for a fresh start." "I understand that sentiment," Temperance said softly as the music ended. Blake kept hold of her hand. "Would you care to walk for a bit? It's a beautiful night." They strolled toward the creek that ran behind the church, the sounds of the gathering fading behind them. The full moon painted the landscape in silver, cicadas providing a chorus in the warm night air. "May I ask you something, Miss Parker?" Blake said as they paused by the creek bank. Temperance tensed slightly but nodded. "You don't have to answer if you don't wish to," he continued carefully. "But I'd like to understand what happened between you and Davis, not out of idle curiosity, but because—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Because I care about your well-being." Temperance was quiet for a long moment, watching the moonlight play on the rippling water. No one in Sonora knew her full story, but something about Blake's steady presence made her want to share the burden she'd carried alone for so long. "I married Leland when I was 19, she began softly. "He courted me for months in Sacramento, where my family had settled after coming west. He was charming, successful in business. My parents were thrilled with the match. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the night was warm. The change came gradually after the wedding. First, it was criticism my cooking, my appearance, the way I spoke to his business associates. Then came the restrictions who I could see, where I could go. When I defied him, Her voice faltered. Blake's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, giving her space to continue at her own pace. The first time he struck me, he wept afterward, promised it would never happen again. I believed him. She touched the scar above her eyebrow. By the third time, I knew the promises were empty. The last night, I thought he might kill me. He'd lost a significant business deal and blamed me for distracting him. I waited until he passed out from drinking, packed what I could carry, and left. "You were brave," Blake said quietly. Temperance gave a bitter laugh. I was terrified. I traveled for months, taking odd jobs, always looking over my shoulder. When I reached Sonora, something about the town felt right. I used my grandmother's maiden name, started sewing for people. Eventually, I saved enough to open my shop. And your family. My parents died in an influenza outbreak the year after I left. My sister Lily was the only one who knew where I was. We corresponded through a post office in Stockton, so Leland couldn't trace the letters. She passed 3 years ago. Blake gently took her hand. "I'm sorry, Temperance." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a tremor through her. "Now Leland has found me," she said, voicing her fear, "and I don't know what to do." "You don't have to run again," Blake said firmly. "This is your home now. You have people who care about you here." "People like you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. In the moonlight, Blake's expression was earnest. "Yes, like me." He stepped closer, and for a breathless moment, Temperance thought he might kiss her. Instead, he lifted her hand and pressed his lips gently to her knuckles. "We should return to the social," he said softly. "People will wonder where we've gone." The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, a trust established, a connection deepened. As they walked back toward the lantern light and music, Temperance felt lighter than she had in years, as if sharing her story had relieved some of the weight she'd carried for so long. The following weeks brought a routine that Temperance gradually came to cherish. Blake would visit her shop every few days, sometimes with minor mending needs, other times simply to talk. He brought her fresh vegetables from his garden and wild honey from hives on his property. She found herself looking forward to the jingle of the bell above her door that signaled his arrival. On a warm Tuesday in late August, Blake invited her to Sunday dinner at his ranch. "Nothing fancy," he assured her, "but I thought you might enjoy seeing the place." Temperance accepted, ignoring the butterflies in her stomach. She hadn't been to a man's home alone since her marriage, but Blake had proven himself trustworthy in every interaction. When Sunday arrived, Blake picked her up in his wagon, and they traveled the 5 miles to his property outside town. Temperance was immediately taken with the ranch, a sturdy main house with a wide porch, surrounded by cottonwood trees for shade. Nearby stood a barn, bunkhouse, and corrals where cattle and horses grazed peacefully. "It's beautiful," she said as he helped her down from the wagon. "It's still a work in progress," Blake replied modestly, "but it's coming along." He showed her around proudly, introducing her to his small staff, Tom and his fiancée Ellen, who kept house, and 2 ranch hands who tipped their hats respectfully. The main house was simply but comfortably furnished, with large windows that let in plenty of light. "I built most of the furniture myself," Blake explained as he showed her the dining table. "My father taught all his sons woodworking." "You're a man of many talents, Mr. Foster," Temperance said admiringly, running her hand over the smooth surface of the table. "Blake," he corrected gently. "I think after all this time you might call me Blake," she smiled. "Blake then, and you must call me Temperance." Dinner was a pleasant affair: roast beef that Blake had prepared himself, vegetables from his garden, and a berry pie that Ellen had baked. The conversation flowed easily, and Temperance found herself laughing more than she had in years. After the meal, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. A comfortable silence settled between them until Blake spoke. "I've been meaning to ask you something, Temperance." She turned to look at him, curious. "Sheriff Holbrook received word yesterday that Leland Davis was seen in Sacramento last week. He appears to be working his way back west. Temperance felt her stomach clench. You think he's coming back to Sonora? It's possible. Blake's expression was serious. I want you to know that you don't have to face him alone, not this time. I can't ask you to put yourself in danger for me again. You're not asking, I'm offering. He took her hand gently. Temperance, in these past months, I've come to care for you deeply. I know you have every reason to be cautious to protect your independence, but I want you to know that my feelings for you are sincere. Temperance felt tears prick at her eyes. Blake, you don't need to say anything now, he assured her. I just wanted you to know where I stand. Whatever happens with Davis, I'll be beside you if you'll allow it. The ride back to town was quiet, both lost in their thoughts. When they reached her house, Blake walked her to the door. Thank you for a lovely day, she said softly. It was my pleasure. He hesitated, then leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. Good night, Temperance. She watched him drive away, her mind whirling with conflicting emotions. Blake Foster was everything her ex-husband was not: kind, respectful, honest. The feelings growing within her frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. 3 days later, the stagecoach brought trouble back to Sonora in the form of Leland Davis. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 rough-looking men accompanied him as he made his way directly to the saloon upon arrival. Word spread quickly. Sheriff Holbrook stopped by Temperance's shop to warn her, his weathered face grave. He's been asking about you, Miss Parker. Claims he has legal documents regarding your marriage. I told him any such matters would need to go through Judge Wilson when he returns next week, but Davis didn't seem inclined to wait. What can I do? Temperance asked, her hands trembling slightly as she set aside the shirt she'd been mending. Stay vigilant. Keep your doors locked. I've deputized 2 men to help keep an eye on things. The sheriff hesitated. Foster already knows. He was in my office when the stage arrived. No sooner had the sheriff left than Blake appeared at her door, his expression tense. Pack a bag, he said without preamble. You're staying at my ranch until this is resolved. Temperance straightened her spine. I can't just abandon my business, my home. You won't be abandoning anything. This is temporary. Blake's voice softened. Please, Temperance. Davis brought hired muscle with him this time. I don't like the look of those men. And what happens when he finds out I've gone to your ranch? He'll just come there instead, putting you and your people at risk. Let him come, Blake said grimly. My property is easier to defend than your shop in the middle of town. Temperance hesitated, torn between her fierce independence and the very real threat Leland posed. Let me think about it. I'll give you my answer by morning. Blake clearly wanted to argue but nodded reluctantly. I'll be back at first light. Please be careful, Temperance. That night, as Temperance prepared for bed, a noise at her back door startled her. Heart racing, she grabbed the revolver she kept hidden in her dresser, a purchase she'd made after fleeing Sacramento. The doorknob rattled, then stilled. I know you're in there, Temp, Leland's voice came, softer than she expected. Just want to talk, that's all. Temperance remained silent, the gun steady in her hands. You've made a nice life here, he continued. Pretty little shop, folks seem to respect you. A pause. That cowboy certainly does. More than respect, I'd wager. The implication in his tone made her blood run cold. I just want what's mine, Temp. You made vows before God. Till death do us part, remember? Temperance finally found her voice. Leave, Leland, there's nothing for you here. A soft laugh. We'll see about that. Sleep tight, wife. Footsteps retreated, and Temperance sank to the floor, shaking. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. When Blake arrived the next morning, Temperance was already waiting with a small valise packed. One look at her pale face told him all he needed to know. He was here, Blake stated rather than asked. Temperance nodded. At my back door last night. Blake's jaw tightened dangerously. Did he hurt you? No, just talked, but his message was clear enough. She lifted her chin determinedly. I'll accept your offer, but only for a few days. I won't be driven from my home permanently. They left a note for Mrs. Daniels explaining that Temperance was taking a short trip to visit friends, asking her to watch over the shop. Then they slipped out of town via the back roads, avoiding Main Street where Leland might be watching. At the ranch, Blake showed Temperance to a comfortable guest room with a view of the mountains. You'll be safe here, he promised. Tom and the boys know to keep an eye out for strangers. The next 3 days passed in an uneasy peace. Temperance tried to make herself useful, helping Ellen with cooking and mending clothes for the ranch hands. Blake rode into town daily to check on things, and returned each time with the news that Leland and his companions remained in Sonora, drinking heavily and asking questions about Blake's ranch. On the 4th day, Blake returned earlier than expected, his expression grave. "Davis filed papers with the county clerk claiming you're still legally his wife," he told Temperance as they sat on the porch. "He's telling people you stole money from him when you left." Temperance's hands clenched in her lap. "That's a lie. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back and what little I'd managed to save from my pin money." "I know," Blake assured her. "No one who knows you believes him for a moment, but he's stirring up trouble trying to force your hand. What does he really want?" Temperance wondered aloud. "It can't simply be about marriage vows, not after 5 years." Blake hesitated. "There might be more to it. I had a telegram sent to a friend in Sacramento asking him to look into Davis's current situation. The reply came today." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Davis is nearly bankrupt. He lost most of his business holdings in poor investments and gambling debts." Understanding dawned on Temperance. "He thinks I have money, or that you could be leveraged for it somehow." Blake's expression darkened. "The man who raised me would be ashamed to hear me speak ill of another, but Davis strikes me as the kind who would do anything when desperate." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Blake stood quickly, his hand moving to his sidearm. "Get inside," he told Temperance quietly. "Use the rifle in my bedroom if necessary." She wanted to protest, but saw the determination in his eyes. With a nod, she retreated into the house, watching anxiously through the window as 3 riders approached Leland and his 2 companions. Blake stood his ground on the porch, waiting as the men dismounted. Tom and another ranch hand emerged from the barn, shotguns in hand, positioning themselves strategically. "Foster," Leland called out, swaying slightly as he approached. "Thought we might have a chat about that property you're harboring." "This is private land, Davis," Blake replied evenly. "You weren't invited." Leland smiled unpleasantly. "My wife is here. That's invitation enough." "Ex-wife," Blake corrected, "and she doesn't want to see you." One of Leland's companions, a tall, scar-faced man, spat tobacco juice in the dirt. "Ain't right for a man to come between husband and wife." "There is no marriage," Blake insisted. "Not anymore." Leland's face darkened. "The law says different. We never divorced. She abandoned our home, stole from me. I have rights." "The only right you have is to leave my property peacefully," Blake said, his voice hardening, "before this gets ugly." From inside, Temperance watched the standoff with mounting dread. Blake stood firmly between the house and Leland, just as he had that day on Main Street, a physical barrier between her and her past. But this time, Leland had backup, and the men looked capable of violence. Making a decision, she moved to the door and stepped outside, ignoring Blake's warning glance. "What do you really want, Leland?" she called out. "After 5 years, why hunt me down now?" Leland's bloodshot eyes fixed on her, a mixture of anger and something else, desperation, perhaps in his gaze. "I want what's owed to me. You took everything when you left." "I took nothing but myself," she retorted, "and that was never yours to own." "Your father's investment," Leland snapped. $20,000 in the shipping company. When you left, his partners pulled out too. Said they couldn't trust a man whose wife fled in the night. Temperance shook her head in disbelief. "My father's investment was lost when your partner embezzled funds. You told me so yourself." "That was a temporary setback," Leland insisted. "I could have recovered if you'd stayed, if your father hadn't turned others against me." "So this is about money," Blake interjected, "not marriage vows." Leland's face twisted with rage. "It's about what's mine. She owes me, and I mean to collect." "I owe you nothing," Temperance said firmly, moving to stand beside Blake. "Whatever financial troubles you have are of your own making, Leland. They always were." One of Leland's companions shifted restlessly, his hand hovering near his pistol. "This is taking too long, Davis." "You said this would be simple." Blake tensed, ready to draw if necessary. "I suggest you all leave now while you still can." Leland stared at them, hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't over, Temp." "Yes," she replied steadily. "It is." For a tense moment, it seemed Leland might order his men to attack. Then, with a bitter curse, he turned and mounted his horse. "You'll regret this," he promised before riding away, his companions following reluctantly. As the dust settled behind the departing riders, Temperance let out a shaky breath. "He'll be back," Blake nodded grimly. "But we'll be ready." That evening, as they sat by the fireplace after dinner, Temperance finally voiced the thought that had been building since Leland's visit. "I need to face him legally once and for all," she said quietly. "No more running, no more hiding." Blake studied her thoughtfully. "Judge Wilson returns on Tuesday. We could present your case, then file for a formal divorce on grounds of cruelty. Would that work, after all this time?" "With witnesses to his behavior here in Sonora, I believe so," Blake assured her. "And if we can prove his claims about stolen money are false, he could face charges for slander." Temperance twisted her hands in her lap. "I'm tired of living in fear, Blake. I want a life where I don't have to look over my shoulder." Blake reached over and covered her hands with his own. "You deserve that and more, Temperance." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. Blake leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Temperance closed the distance, their lips meeting in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened with unspoken longing. When they finally parted, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for months," he admitted softly. "So have I," Temperance confessed, surprised at her own boldness. They stayed by the fire late into the night, talking and planning. By morning, they had decided on a course of action. Judge Wilson's return to Sonora on Tuesday brought the confrontation to a head. Temperance, Blake, and Sheriff Holbrook presented their case in the judge's chambers, including testimonies from townspeople who had witnessed Leland's behavior and threats. Leland, summoned to appear, arrived with a Sacramento lawyer who attempted to argue that Temperance had abandoned her marital duties and stolen property. "Your Honor," the lawyer said smoothly, "Mrs. Davis left without legal separation, taking valuable items from their shared home. My client has been searching for her only to reclaim what is rightfully his and restore their marriage." Judge Wilson, a no-nonsense man who had seen many frontier disputes, turned to Temperance. "Mrs. Davis or Miss Parker, as you've been known here, did you remove valuables from your marital home when you departed?" Temperance stood straight, her voice clear. "No, Your Honor. I left with my personal clothing and a locket that had belonged to my grandmother, nothing more," she lies. Leland interjected, his face flushed. "She took money, jewelry. Be silent, Mr. Davis," the judge warned. "You'll have your turn." The proceedings continued for hours, with witnesses called from both Sonora and, surprisingly, Sacramento. A business associate of Temperance's father had traveled to testify that Leland's claims about the investment were false records, showed the money had indeed been lost through mismanagement months before Temperance fled. As the afternoon wore on, Leland grew increasingly agitated, especially when Sheriff Holbrook testified about his disruptive and threatening behavior in town. Finally, Judge Wilson cleared his throat. "I've heard enough. Based on the evidence presented, I find grounds for dissolution of marriage due to cruelty and abandonment on the part of Mr. Davis." Leland surged to his feet. "This is outrageous. She's my wife, not anymore," the judge stated firmly. "Furthermore, I find Mr. Davis's claims of theft to be unsubstantiated and possibly malicious. Miss Parker is free to continue using her maiden name, and Mr. Davis is ordered to cease all harassment immediately." Turning to the sheriff, he added, "Mr. Davis and his companions are to leave Sonora by tomorrow morning. Should they return with similar intent, they will be arrested for harassment." Leland's face contorted with rage, but his lawyer gripped his arm, whispering urgently in his ear. With a final venomous glare at Temperance, he stormed out of the chamber. The relief that washed over Temperance was overwhelming. 5 years of looking over her shoulder, of fearing discovery, had finally ended. She was legally free. Blake was waiting outside the courthouse. When she emerged and nodded, a smile broke across his face. He crossed to her and took her hands in his. "It's over," she said, hardly believing it herself. "A new beginning," he corrected gently. Sheriff Holbrook exited behind them. "I'll make sure Davis and his friends leave town as ordered," he assured them. "Though something tells me he won't risk further legal trouble. Men like that are bullies, they back down when stood up to properly." That evening, Blake insisted on celebrating. He took Temperance to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the finest establishment in Sonora. As they enjoyed their meal, townspeople stopped by their table to offer congratulations and support. "I never expected such kindness," Temperance admitted as Mrs. Wilson, the judge's wife, squeezed her shoulder warmly before leaving. "When I came to Sonora, I kept to myself deliberately, afraid to form connections." "People respect courage," Blake replied, "and you've shown plenty of that." After dinner, they walked through town in the gentle evening air. Lanterns glowed in windows, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. When they reached the small bridge over the creek, Blake stopped. "Temperance," he began, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I know this might seem rushed, given everything that's happened. But the truth is, I've been certain of my feelings for some time now." He took her hands in his. "I love you. I love your strength, your dignity, your kindness. I love the way you hum when you sew, how you always have flour on your nose when you bake, how your eyes crinkle at the corners when you really smile." Temperance felt tears forming as Blake continued. "I don't want to pressure you. I know you've just regained your freedom, and that's precious. But I want you to know that whenever, if ever, you might consider a future together, I'm here. Not to own you or control you, but to walk beside you as an equal partner in life." She reached up to touch his face, her heart fuller than she'd ever thought possible. "Blake Foster, you astonish me. When I came to Sonora, I'd given up on the idea of love. I thought that part of me was broken forever. And now," he asked softly, "now I know better." She smiled through her tears. "I love you too. You stood between me and danger without hesitation, not to own me, but to protect my right to choose my own path. How could I not love you for that?" Blake's smile was radiant as he pulled her closer. "Does that mean you might consider becoming Mrs. Foster someday, when you're ready?" Temperance laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I think I might be ready sooner than either of us expected." Their kiss sealed a promise that neither took lightly, a future built on respect, trust, and a love that had flourished in the most unexpected circumstances. The following morning, Sheriff Holbrook confirmed that Leland and his companions had departed on the early stage. "Good riddance," he said cheerfully, "though I suspect our town will miss the excitement." "I've had quite enough excitement," Temperance replied with a smile. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new pattern. Temperance continued her seamstress business, but she also spent more time at Blake's ranch, getting to know the rhythms of life there. The ranch hands quickly grew fond of her, especially when she proved herself handy with not only needle and thread, but also in the kitchen. Blake, for his part, began building an addition to the main house, a sunlit room that would serve perfectly as a sewing studio. "So you don't have to choose between your work and ranch life," he explained when he showed her the plans. On a perfect autumn day in October 1880, with golden leaves drifting from the cottonwoods and the mountains painted in russet and gold, Temperance Parker married Blake Foster in a simple ceremony at the Sonora church. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which spilled from the church into the street with music, dancing, and enough food to feed a small army. Mrs. Daniels had baked a 3-tiered cake adorned with fresh flowers. Sheriff Holbrook, who had become a dear friend, gave the bride away. Even Judge Wilson made an appearance, offering his congratulations and a fine bottle of brandy as a wedding gift. As Blake twirled his new wife around the dance floor, Temperance felt a sense of homecoming unlike anything she'd ever known. This man, this honorable, steady, loving man, had stood between her and her darkest fears, never wavering, and now he would stand beside her for all the days to come. "Happy, Mrs. Foster," he murmured in her ear as they danced. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she replied honestly. Later that night, as they stood on the porch of their ranch home, looking out at the star-filled sky, Blake wrapped his arms around her from behind. "I was thinking," he said quietly, "that we might expand the ranch next year. The Henley property to the east is available, and it has good water access. Planning for the future already." Temperance teased gently. Our future, he corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple, which I hope will be a long and fruitful one. She turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his in the moonlight. I like the sound of that. 1 year later, in the autumn of 1881, Temperance gave birth to their first child, a strong, healthy boy they named Daniel, after Blake's father. Standing by the window of their bedroom, Blake cradled his son with a look of wonder on his face. He has your eyes, he told Temperance, who watched from the bed with a contented smile. And your chin, she replied. Stubborn already. The family continued to grow along with the ranch. A daughter, Lily, named for Temperance's beloved sister, joined them in 1883, followed by twin boys, James and Thomas, in 1886. Through it all, Blake and Temperance's partnership only strengthened, each challenge faced together, each joy multiplied by sharing. Temperance continued her sewing work, though now she specialized in fine garments that were shipped as far as San Francisco. Blake's ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in the county. They built a larger home to accommodate their growing family, but kept the original house for visiting relatives and friends. News came occasionally from Sacramento. Leland had moved east after a series of failed business ventures, eventually settling in Chicago. The information stirred no emotion in Temperance, beyond a fleeting sadness for the young, naive girl she had once been. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1890, Blake surprised Temperance with a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation since their marriage. As they stood on the deck of a ferry crossing the bay, watching the sunset paint the water in shimmering gold, Blake pulled her close. Any regrets? He asked, a question he posed every year on their anniversary. And as she had every year before, Temperance shook her head. Not one, she answered truthfully. Every step of my journey, even the painful ones, led me to you. How could I regret that? Blake's smile was tender as he kissed her, still as passionately in love as the day they wed. To think it all began because I refused to move aside on Main Street. Thank God for stubborn cowboys, Temperance murmured against his lips. The years continued to flow, bringing changes both expected and surprising. Their children grew, the ranch prospered, and the town of Sonora evolved from a rough mining settlement to a proper community. Through it all, Blake and Temperance remained each other's steadfast partners, their love deepening with each passing season. In 1915, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and a lifetime of memories, they celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary. Though Blake's hair had turned silver and Temperance's chestnut locks were streaked with gray, the way they looked at each other remained unchanged, full of love, respect, and gratitude for the life they had built together. I still remember the way you stood between me and danger that day, Temperance told him as they sat on their porch swing, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Not moving an inch, even with a gun pointed at you. Blake took her hand, his fingers still strong despite the years of ranch work. Best decision I ever made, he said simply. Standing my ground that day meant I could stand beside you for all the days that followed. As the California sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Temperance rested her head on her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that sometimes the darkest storms lead to the brightest rainbows, and that love, when built on respect and trust, could withstand any challenge life might bring. In the end, it wasn't the desperate flight from Sacramento or the confrontation in Sonora that defined Temperance's life. It was the countless quiet moments shared with Blake, the gentle touch of hands across a dinner table, laughter echoing through their home, the solid warmth of his presence beside her each night. It was the family they had created together and the legacy of love they would leave behind. And it had all begun because a cowboy had stood his ground and refused to move aside.